In the glass-walled elevator of a Fortune 500 skyscraper, a billionaire CEO lifted the collar of a nervous single dad, slow, deliberate, intimate, before leaning close enough that his breath warmed the man's ear. "You smell different today," he whispered. But the single dad had no idea that scent wasn't just cologne, it was danger, power, and a secret that would turn his entire life upside down. If you love shocking twists, billionaire tension, secret identities, and emotional gut-punch stories, hit subscribe now so you never miss the next chapter. Because what happens next will stay with you long after you finish reading. Ethan Cole had never expected his life to intersect with the upper floors of the Sterling International Tower, let alone with the man who owned it, the enigmatic CEO Adrian Sterling, known across America and the UK as the ruthless strategist who could bankrupt a corporation before breakfast and still charm an entire boardroom by lunch. But that morning, as Ethan rushed into the building with his son Mason's forgotten lunchbox in one hand and his half-tucked shirt fluttering in the lobby breeze, the universe seemed determined to shove him into a world he didn't belong in, a world polished to a mirror shine and smelling faintly of power, bergamot, and decisions worth billions. He'd been working in facilities maintenance for 6 months now, taking janitorial night shifts and early morning handyman runs just to keep Mason in school since the loss of his wife 2 years earlier had left him juggling fatherhood, grief, and survival all at once, and though he'd never once been late, today the elevator doors slid shut right before he could step in, sealing him out of the executive-level ride he needed to take in order to fix a ventilation issue on the 63rd floor, so he sprinted for the next one, nearly colliding with a tall, sharply dressed figure whose presence felt like stepping into a cold current of authority. That was Adrian Sterling himself, though Ethan had only seen him from a distance, his tailored charcoal suit catching the light like a blade, his eyes an unreadable mix of gray and silver that rumors claimed could size up a person's entire past and potential within seconds, and when he pressed a button and the doors opened, Ethan realized with muted horror that he'd just stepped into the CEO's private lift, a place employees generally avoided unless invited, yet Adrian didn't say a word, only gave a small tilt of his head as if acknowledging Ethan's panic before the doors slid shut with a soft sigh, sealing them in alone, silence humming like electricity. Ethan's nerves buzzed as the elevator ascended, but then Adrian turned, gaze sliding briefly over Ethan's messy appearance, the loose collar, the slightly damp strands of hair sticking to his forehead from his sprint, the crumpled lunchbox, and without warning he reached out, fingers brushing the edge of Ethan's collar with a slow, deliberate movement that made the air between them thicken, adjusting the fabric as though he had every right to touch him, smoothing it with a level of precision Ethan had only ever seen tailors use on expensive suits, and Ethan froze, unsure what to say, his breath caught somewhere between apology and confusion, when Adrian leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper, low enough that it felt meant only for Ethan's skin rather than his ears, and he said, "You smell different today," a statement so unexpected Ethan could only blink because he hadn't put on cologne, hadn't done anything except rush out of his tiny apartment after Mason got cereal spilled on his shirt, and the only scent he could imagine carrying was the faint trace of the lavender soap Mason insisted they use because it reminded him of his mother, but something in Adrian's tone wasn't casual observation, it was sharp, curious, almost as though he recognized something Ethan didn't yet understand, and before Ethan could form a response, the elevator jolted to a stop, the lights above flickering once, twice, then steadying, but something in that moment, in the subtle tension that sparked in Adrian's usually composed expression, told Ethan this wasn't a normal elevator delay. A faint alarm blinked quietly on the panel, a tiny red light that didn't match the usual mechanical error indicators Ethan was trained to handle, and Adrian stepped back slightly, though not in fear, in calculation, as though assessing angles, risks, escape routes, and for a second Ethan forgot the man was a CEO and not a covert operative in a thriller film because the shift in energy was stark, intentional, practiced, but then Adrian pressed a hidden button behind the control panel, something Ethan had never seen during routine maintenance, and without explanation the elevator resumed, smoother than before, the small red light disappearing as if it had never existed, leaving Ethan feeling as though he had just witnessed a secret he wasn't supposed to see. The doors opened onto the 63rd floor, pristine as always with glass walls, quiet conference rooms, and a view of the city that looked too perfect to belong to real people, and as Ethan stepped out, expecting Adrian to continue upward to his private floor, the CEO followed him instead, saying calmly, "I'll walk with you," which made no sense at all because Adrian Sterling did not walk with maintenance staff anywhere, ever. But before Ethan could question it, a sudden crash echoed from deeper within the floor, followed by hurried footsteps, and 3 security personnel rushed past them, muttering something about unauthorized access, prompting Adrian to give Ethan a glance not of fear but of recognition, as if he had expected this moment, as if the scent he'd commented on earlier was connected to this break-in, and Ethan's pulse quickened because suddenly he was aware of something he hadn't noticed when getting dressed. Mason had hugged him tightly that morning, transferring a faint powdery scent from the small wooden box his wife had left behind before her death. A box Ethan hadn't opened in years, one that contained documents from her old research job, files he never understood but always stored carefully, and now Adrian Sterling was staring at him as though that scent meant Ethan was no longer just a single dad struggling through the day. He was a piece of a puzzle Ethan didn't know existed, one that powerful men had been waiting a very long time to solve. Adrian didn't speak as the security team disappeared around the corner, but his expression sharpened in a way that made Ethan's stomach twist, not with fear of the CEO, but with the sudden suspicion that everything happening around him was not random, not coincidental, and definitely not just another hectic morning. Adrian stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Ethan could hear, his tone controlled but edged with urgency, saying, "We don't have much time, and before you ask, no, I'm not going to explain everything yet, not here," which only deepened Ethan's confusion because this floor was usually empty at this hour, yet Adrian was scanning it like a battlefield, checking reflections in the glass, angles of approach, pressure points in the architecture, and then he gestured for Ethan to follow as he walked toward the far end of the corridor where a conference room sat empty, sunlight slicing across the polished floor like cold fire. Inside, he shut the door quietly and tapped once on the wall panel where a discreet security lock clicked into place, sealing them in, and Ethan felt his pulse thrum in his throat because the intensity in Adrian's usually unreadable eyes was no longer just corporate precision. It was something closer to recognition, familiarity, and maybe even protectiveness, though Ethan couldn't understand why a billionaire CEO would look at him that way. Adrian exhaled slowly as though weighing how much truth to reveal, then said, "The scent I mentioned earlier wasn't cologne. It was a compound, rare, outdated, and nearly impossible to find outside of a few classified research facilities," and Ethan startled because all he'd done was hug his son and rush out the door. Nothing unusual, but when he thought about the morning, about Mason climbing into his lap to grab the little wooden box his late mother used to keep under their bed, one Ethan never opened because it felt too much like trespassing on memories, he felt a chill ripple down his spine. The box had snapped open by accident when Mason dropped it, scattering papers and a tiny cracked vial with a faint powdery residue onto the kitchen floor, and Ethan had swept everything back inside without examining it, simply relieved Mason wasn't hurt. But now Adrian watched him with an intensity that made Ethan feel stripped bare, as though the CEO could see every memory, every fear, every struggle woven into him. "Whatever was in that box," Adrian continued, "someone wants it, and they're willing to infiltrate my building to get it," and Ethan couldn't breathe for a moment because the last thing he expected was to be caught in something dangerous, something his wife had never warned him about, something she'd taken to her grave without explanation. Adrian moved closer, so close Ethan could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the icy tension in the room, and he asked quietly, "Did your wife ever tell you what she worked on before she died?" Which hit Ethan like a blow because she had always said her research wasn't important, just administrative paperwork for a pharmaceutical subsidiary, nothing worth discussing, but now fragments of the past rattled loose in Ethan's memory. Late night calls she never explained, trips she never talked about, quiet moments where she stared at Mason as though memorizing him before she left for long shifts, and suddenly Ethan's chest tightened as he whispered, "She didn't tell me anything," because the truth was she did hide things, but he'd never questioned her, never imagined they might matter after her death. Adrian's jaw tightened in a way that looked almost personal, as though this revelation hit him too, and he whispered, "She wasn't administrative staff, Ethan. She was part of a classified bio-research division, one my company funded in partnership with the government," which made Ethan's knees weaken, forcing him into the nearest chair as the room seemed to tilt. But Adrian didn't let him spiral, placing a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder, grounding him with surprising gentleness for a man who terrified entire boards of directors. "The compound I smelled on you," Adrian said, leaning in just enough that Ethan felt breath near his ear again, "shouldn't exist anymore. It was discontinued after the project shut down, the same year your wife died," and that coincidence struck Ethan like lightning, intertwining grief with dread. But before he could ask more, before he could demand the truth Adrian was clearly withholding, the sound of footsteps pounded down the hallway, fast, heavy, intentional, followed by the unmistakable hiss of a security override attempting to breach the conference room door. Adrian's expression didn't falter, but his eyes flashed with something fierce, protective, almost dangerous, and he whispered, "Stay behind me," in a tone that brooked no argument, as he moved toward the door with a controlled, predatory grace that made Ethan Realize Adrian Sterling was far more than a corporate mastermind. He was a man who lived prepared for threats, a man who knew exactly what to do when danger arrived, a man whose presence felt like a shield as the door lock glowed red, the panel flickering under unauthorized access attempts, and Ethan realized with a jolt of terror and awe that the break-in wasn't random, the timing wasn't accidental, and Adrian's sudden interest in him wasn't coincidence. It was fate closing in, secrets rising from the past, and enemies Ethan didn't know existed coming for him, and Adrian was the only person standing between him and a threat he still couldn't fully see. The door finally gave way with a metallic snap, but before it could swing open fully, Adrian grabbed Ethan's wrist and pulled him toward a hidden exit panel behind the conference room display screen, pressing his palm to a biometric lock that revealed a narrow maintenance tunnel Ethan had never seen on any building schematic. They slipped inside just as masked intruders stormed the room, their voices sharp, demanding the carrier and the vial, and Ethan's heart nearly stopped because they were talking about him and the broken container from his wife's box, the one Mason had accidentally opened that morning, the one Ethan now realized held something far more dangerous than sentimental value. As they hurried through the dim corridor, Adrian finally explained in clipped, focused words that the compound on Ethan's clothes was a dormant trace of a classified biochemical formula Ethan's wife had developed not as a weapon, but as a cure, something capable of reversing certain cellular decay patterns but valuable enough to be stolen, exploited, fought over, and ultimately buried after her mysterious death, which now seemed far less accidental than Ethan had ever imagined. When they emerged in the parking garage, alarms blaring throughout the tower, Adrian unlocked his armored SUV with a command from his watch and practically shoved Ethan inside, telling him that the intruders were remnants of a private organization that had once attempted to seize the research division and had resurfaced now because the compound's signature had reappeared on Ethan, of all people. After years of silence, the SUV shot into traffic, weaving through streets as Adrian assured him Mason was already safe, evacuated by loyal security the moment the breach alarm triggered, and the relief that flooded Ethan's chest was enough to bring him near tears. But what broke him entirely was Adrian's voice softening as he said, "Your wife trusted you with something she never had the chance to explain. Let me help you protect it, protect him," and the sincerity cut through Ethan's panic like warmth in a freezing storm. By the time they reached a secure safe house on the outskirts of the city, Ethan felt the weight of the past settling in, but he also felt, shockingly, less alone than he had in years, and when Adrian adjusted Ethan's collar again, mirroring the moment in the elevator that had begun this entire spiral, he whispered, this time not analyzing but reassuring, "You're safe with me. Both of you," a promise that felt dangerously like the beginning of something deeper, something neither of them had expected. And as the door locked behind them and the world outside descended into chaos, Ethan realized that whatever future lay ahead, with secrets, threats, and the truth of his wife's work still to uncover, he wouldn't be facing it alone anymore, because Adrian Sterling, the man the world feared, had chosen to stand at his side, not out of duty or obligation but something far more profound that neither could ignore.